Manager of Partnerships at NYC Media Lab. This is the 2 o'clock panel. I'll be moderating this session to focus on why designing for people and people's contexts and behaviors and routines and preferences, why that matters in a machine-driven world. We've got a great group of panelists. I have to say I'm personally a fan of all of the company products represented here. I'm a subscriber to the Times. I wake up with the Skim, and I use Slack every day. And for David, I'm excited about what he's doing at Parsons. He is teaching a class called Designing AI that encourages his students to embrace human diversity when prototyping with machine learning technologies. So the goal of our conversation is to share how user experiences and human audience understanding are key for AI and automation roadmaps in our digital media industry. Our speakers are leading experiments and building out teams that set expectations for keeping human-centered design as a focus for developers and data scientists and the teams that they work with. They're looking at their customer and user data as a way to learn about their customers to deliver more and relevant, valuable experiences in our day of information overload. So I'd like to invite the panelists up to the stage. How about starting with you, Chris?
Sure.
You're an applied math scientist with a PhD in theoretical physics. You work for a 166-year-old publisher, and you've been with the Times since 2014. So what do you do as chief data scientist?
So the data science group focuses on how we can use machine learning methods to solve problems, both in the newsroom and on the business side. So it's a team of, I think, 7 people right now, and we focus on developing and deploying algorithms. So by that I mean, in addition to having insights, that is designing machine learning that's useful for people to understand, we also deploy the algorithm, so we try to build data product. Most of this data product is internally used, so we have the benefit that we can talk directly to our target audience. We can go, talk to editors or talk to product people or marketing people or other people who might be using our technology. And we found that sort of leading from the customer or design thinking has been really useful in building things that people use.
Mm-hmm. Next we have Jerry, who's part of the Search Learning and Intelligence team. It's a new team with a new office here in New York City. The head of your group, Noah Weiss, says that your group exists to make people feel less overwhelmed by the information that's in Slack. So your group is focusing on giving users superpowers to find fast answers. So what brought you to this team, and what do you do at Slack?
For me, it was really interesting because prior to coming to Slack, I had run a startup that did what all startups do, which is die miserably and waste a lot of people's money. But at least we weren't like pressing juice or something like that, so it was fine. But when we wound that down, my job search was focused around looking at all the products and services that we had used at Apropos, and then applying to all of those companies for the places that we had really loved. And Slack was the big winner just because we turned Slack on, I think, in month 8 at Apropos, and it just fundamentally altered the way that we communicated basically overnight. And so that was why I came to be the first engineering manager at SLI, where we're really trying to take this incredibly rich repository of work data that we're in this unique position to capture and do the same thing for that data source that Google did for the web in the late 1990s. So being at SLI right now at Slack feels a lot like being on like the Google Ads team in like 1999, because we just have all the data and we have to figure out what to do with
it. You can tell he loves his job. So next we have Deirdre. You're building out a daily news product aimed at women. It's a simple daily email and your users are hooked. So tell us about your background and your story.
Sure. So I press juice. Just kidding. I came to the Skim from ESPN, where I was on the engineering and product teams for a while, and was really excited to join a company that was thinking about how to deliver information in a totally new way. So we think about building products as how do we deliver news and information right into people's routines that make it easy for them. So we do that by marrying a very conversational tone. So when you're reading about the news or reading about a topic, it feels like it's your friend talking to you. And we marry that with a delivery mechanism that fits right into your routine. So our core product is our email newsletter, the Daily Skim, that we've had for a few years now, and it's very popular. But we are now starting to build products beyond that that also fit into other routines. So we launched an app last year that puts content into your calendar. So whether it's the Supreme Court hearings, whether it's the Oscars, whether it's the NFL draft on Thursday, it helps you sort of stay ahead of the game, putting that information right into your calendar. So the way we think about products and building products is really just that marriage of voice and information into your routines.
Great. And then finally, we have David. You are an MIT Media Lab grad. You've got AI experience with car companies such as BMW and Ford. And now you're on the faculty at Parsons teaching a new class on AI, designing with AI. So could you share more about your background?
Sure. So my background originally was in computer science, and I studied AI back in the 80s, so a different era. And sort of after doing that for a couple of years, decided to switch and move into a design career. So I've worked in a lot of different capacities as a consultant with my own studio. It feels like over the last 8 or 9 years, I've spent a lot of time in mobility. So I worked for BMW. The last 2 years, I had been sort of leading user experience and design and innovation for Ford Motor Company on a range of global pilots and experiments around sort of future mobility services and solutions. And so it was a lot of trying to figure out, like, how do we put a new project into the world that's driven by some sort of a technology origin, but what's the thing that excites users to want to use it and engage with it? Mm-hmm. And then the last year, I've started teaching at Parsons New School around this idea of designing AI with the notion that AI is coming so fast and so quickly that we need as many voices as possible to be engaged in thinking about what applications and what uses we want AI to have. And that we can't limit this only to people that have technical experience. And so what are ways for non-technical people to develop intuitions and new languages for thinking about what you can do with AI?
Mm-hmm. So now that we have everyone's background, I thought we'd start off with a general question on what does human-centered design mean to you? Do you think of yourselves as evangelists for human-centered design, especially when you're working with the technical teams across your organizations?
Certainly within my own group, it's sort of mandatory. I remember years ago, there was an editor who asked us if we could help solve some problem. And I said to the software engineer, who I thought was the appropriate person to lead it, you are about to become the forward deploy ambassador for machine learning into the newsroom. Go read this book on how to do customer interviews. So we really started with interviewing people, asking them about their workflow, asking them about their pain points, and trying to figure out what is their process. Because my experience had been there's just no point building an awesome machine learning algorithm if you can't find some way to integrate it into people's process, or in this case, integrate it into company process. So that's where it starts. Just like in the little design thinking cartoon, it starts with empathy. It really started with that. You go and you find out what their pain points are, and you try to then meet a solution to that. And thereon, it goes in a way that's part of the original Agile manifesto that you should get regular feedback from the end user. So I want to make sure that everyone in my group has regular contact with the end user, not some intermediary person, but an actual end user. And somebody, before we start a project, somebody's got to commit to at least 15 minutes a week of direct feedback from the eventual end user. Mm-hmm. And again, we can do that because we're building internal data products, so it's easy to, someone in the building usually is the person who's going to be the target end user. So that's a big part of making sure that we build something people want.
Mm-hmm.
I would echo that. Just the greatest surprise of my professional career. I went to Stanford. I got a PhD. I did all of this stuff with machine learning, blah, 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 blah. And then most of my life consists of looking at people and asking, why are we building this particular UI affordance instead of that one, because it doesn't, you can have arbitrary sophistication behind some kind of model, and if you aren't sure what problem you're solving for people and you don't know that you're delivering them value, then it really just doesn't matter what your classification error is or how much data you have or any of those other things. And so that's very surprising how much every day it's these design thinking skills. It is ethnography, it is user research, it is iteration, as opposed to, arbitrarily deep neural nets.
How do you consider all the different types of users and those personas, though? Because your products reach so many people.
It's really hard. I think that's one thing at Slack that we talk about a lot internally, where the use cases of, say, a 10-person startup that's on our platform, they have 5 channels, everybody reads all of the messages. That's very, very, very different than a Fortune 500 CIO who's in 450 channels, who has 10,000 messages, every time they come back from a coffee break. So we focus a lot on trying not to solve all of the problems for everyone at the same time. Generally, if you can identify a persona that has a real problem and make some progress on that, you're well ahead of the game.
I was going to add, I think these are exactly right, that user-centered design needs to be foundational in how organizations approach design. And it's always surprising when you enter a company that's not used to that, so that they have such entrenched or sort of legacy processes that they haven't thought too much about their user because they've just done things the way they've always done them. Sort of two notes to that is, when I was doing work with Ford, we would do user-centered design, which again for them was a new sort of way of doing things, because they'd done the same thing for 100 years and there was no reason to change that. And so we would do pilots in individual cities to try new sorts of services. But what we also needed to do was to think about how do those pilots change or scale as you put them in other parts of the world. And so as you think about different cultures and different sort of geographies of cities and different sort of behaviors, there's ways in which a concept or a service you have may change pretty fundamentally. And so this notion of you need to kind of figure out, well, what's your core set of users, at least for your initial starting point, but then how do you begin to diversify and make that broader as you go? The second point I'd add is that user-centered design, I think, within the design world has become kind of, it's natural. This is what we have to do. But as we think about emerging technologies like AI, the user may not be the center anymore. And so we may need to start thinking about new methods that are sort of user participant or kind of co-act. I don't know what it is yet, but I think we need to be experimenting about new types of design methods that allow the user to be just one part of the conversation.
Deirdre, I'm curious about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I would say, obviously, like everybody says, user-centered design is not just the hot new thing. It is the way everybody should and is thinking now. The way we like to think about it is that we don't start with the product, we start with the person, and then we figure out what are their information gaps, what does their day look like, what are points in their lives and their days and their weeks where they just wish they knew something, and then how do we solve that? And that solution might be a newsletter today, it might be an app tomorrow, it might be something totally different in 5 years. And if you start with that problem and that user need, then you have fundamentally this culture as a company where you aren't stuck to a specific product. And I think that is what a lot of people are starting to adopt, especially in media, where media traditionally is often sort of product first. And I think a lot of people are starting to kind of shift that around to really think about, how do we just adapt to behaviors and lifestyles changing as the world evolves. And so that's kind of definitely how we think. I think, going to your persona question, we have it a little bit easier, I think. We are very focused on a 22 to 34-year-old working professional female. But at the same time, we do a lot of layering quantitative and qualitative to just understand the different segmentation even within that demographic. So how many of them are commuting by subway versus car? How many of them are, in certain industries? what is their purchasing power, and using obviously like, kind of the more research efforts like your diary studies, but layering that with some of the more quantitative efforts to really understand at a high level, like who are the different types of users that we're trying to solve for within that cohort.
I'd love to touch on automated workflows or how you're bringing in new workflows into different teams at your organizations and how you're making sure that those workflows are staying people-centric.
If I could just say one more thing about personas. One useful thing about personas is to at least start with actual persons. So before you start thinking about, I'm going to take a whole bunch of data and cluster it into different people or whatever, it's useful if you can just convince one end user to just be the alpha example, or hopefully a few examples, and really just build out a relationship with them in the form of something that works. And in addition to all the AI that may be powering the product, make it easy for the person to give you data so that you can keep track of whether or not people are actually using the things.
All right. Just going back to my question. Just considering how AI and automation in your organizations, particularly like a legacy one, how are you looking at the workflows that AI is helping and how those workflows are staying people-centric?
Yeah, it's definitely an old org with an old process, but the whole digital transition is a big focus of the newsroom right now. And people who work there are people who use the internet in their real lives, so they're not, it's not unfamiliar to them to think, oh, how could I use technology and use data to make this process more efficient? A lot of it comes from talking to people and finding out what are the things that they find frustrating. One thing that I've said internally to my group is, it's not so useful to go to somebody and say, I'm going to develop an algorithm that's going to replace this thing that you do. It's much more useful to go to them and say, tell me about your process, what's your relationship with IT? And at some point they'll say, man, this thing is a pain in the ass. And you say, golly, I wish I could build an algorithm that would help you with that thing that was a pain in the ass, right? And so usually starting with some sort of actual frustration that an actual person has is a great place to start. And everybody knows that there's plenty of ways to augment what we do and to make what we do more efficient. There's all sorts of ways in which much of machine learning is somewhere an optimization problem with data in it. And so it's not that hard to think of problems that we face and think how we could make it more efficient and use efficiency as part of that optimization.
I feel like your question is a little bit of a softball for me because that's sort of basically exactly our entire business summed up in one night's question, because our goal is to just take all of these processes and problems that you regularly encounter at work and make it easier for you to do them. And I guess the only thing that I would really say there that is perhaps interesting is the first step in machine learning is always kind of getting your hands on data and playing with it and understanding it, like looking at it. For many of these kinds of processes, these human-centric processes, that's really the first thing that Slack was able to do. We haven't automated everything yet. We haven't built a nice bot for every possible thing, but we've put all of the data in one place. I'll take one task, hiring somebody. It's probably a task that everyone here has dealt with in one way or another. I don't know how that works right now for all of you, but the way it worked at places that I've been in the past is there's been an email chain back and forth, and usually there are a couple of meetings, and maybe there's an inbound lead platform, and then a thing that you use to score like their homework that you send them, and then the results of their interviews and feedback, and all of that information is just plastered all over the place. And so with Slack, what we do internally and what so many other companies are doing, so we just create a channel per candidate. So every time a new candidate comes in, we make a channel for them, and all of the communication about whether or not to hire that person and the results of everything goes in that one place. We haven't gotten to the point where we're really assisting with that workflow, but it's amazing what just shining a flashlight on all of that data and putting it in one place and making it available to people can do for them. And also it gives us this great starting point to turn around and say, all right, now we've got all the data, what can we do to help make your life better?
I think we can actually open it up to the audience for questions now. We have several mics running around the room, so perhaps we can start over here, right here in the front.
Hello, thank you for being on the panel today. I am a UX designer, so I have a question about accessibility and how you guys are implementing that and how you're working toward making things more accessible for people with disabilities. So I'd just like to hear from all of you what you're doing about that, if you're testing with those people, and what you have to say about it and the future of it.
David could start.
Sure. So I can answer that maybe in two parts. One is sort of the sort of day-to-day accessibility and making sure that your product is accessible to people. And part of that is making sure that you're testing it with the right group of people, that you have enough diversity of candidates and places in which you're trying it, and seeing, when it's used in different contexts, how different the use experience can be. And so new accessibility issues come up there also. I think the other thing that we need to be thinking about is not just accessibility, but also ways in which bias or cultural bias may get built into these systems that create a new type of disaccessibility. Is that a word? And, it's not to say that there's some sort of a checklist that you can do that would make sure that your systems don't have bias or that are purely accessible, but a lot of it is making sure that the teams that are working on your projects are diverse, and that the places in which you're testing your projects are sort of diverse also, because it's only through multiple voices and perspectives that you can get sort of a real sense of what your project or product is.
Yeah, I would probably tackle it in two buckets. So one is, just as we're doing like core product development, whether it's the app or even the newsletter, just really just having having some of these cases in mind, right? So, I know we talked a little bit about like colorblindness, or just making sure, we are using dynamic type in the app, like just in general, like making sure as you're going through the product development process that you have all of these cases in mind. The other bucket is, I think, really interesting, which is that there are just a lot more interfaces now being evolved and developed that are really exciting, because the way we think about it is like we just want to get information to people in a way that's easiest for them, and so obviously things like voice makes that very exciting, right? Because it opens up a window to a ton of different types of interfaces that appeal to very different types of audiences, that make that, instead of complicating it, just make it really exciting. It just opens up the window to a lot of opportunity for us.
I would really echo that. At Slack, there's a part of the UX's team's mandate is to think about these things from just a straightforward how do you interact with the core product kind of level. And I can't really speak to that because I'm not directly involved in it. But in SLI, we think a lot about these problems kind of in that same way of what is the next step of, you want to call them multimodal interfaces, where we have all of this data, we have all these abilities to kind of take content and repurpose it or put interactions in a different way for different people, and thinking about just sort of holistically expanding those processes to include people with disabilities, people with different ways of learning, people with different backgrounds who consume information in different ways. The hope is that when we really get good at doing sort of this prediction, machine learning and repurposing, we'll be able to fold all of those people into that mix and really build new interfaces that just make it easier.
I think for the internal data product, what you see is as you expand the scope of people, or the set of people who are using your product, you find these sort of shocks where something that, was an implicit assumption among the alpha set of testers just totally is not there, and you go to a bigger group, particularly in things where you're rendering something that's complex, like you're trying to make sense of some very complicated data viz or something like that. You might build it, and internally within your group, if you haven't been circulating it to a very diverse audience, you build something internally in your group, and that tells the same story to everybody in your group because we built it. And then as you go out and you expand the set of people, if you don't make it easy for them to tell you that it doesn't make any sense, you'll sort of pay a technical debt, where later you show something to somebody and it's meaningless to them. It doesn't speak to their own experiences. So part of that is to early try to expand to some representative set from who you want to be your eventual audience, and then just to make it really easy for people to give you feedback.
I think we have one question up here in the front as well.
It's really exhilarating to hear you talk about tackling these problems. One of the great frustrations of journalists, it's sort of legendary, the bean counter. And for reporting is very intuitive, as we all know. And in some profit, austerity-driven corporations which own news organizations, they cut back to the very minimum, and they don't recognize a way of recognizing that this could be a really good story. Is there a program in use in any of the news organizations you know about to help the bean counter understand the importance of, yes, going to Vancouver and then to La Paz, Bolivia might produce a story of great importance?
I mean, this is a topic of regular discussion at the Times. Every time there's Pulitzer Day, somewhere in somebody's Pulitzer speech, they say, take a minute to recognize that, like, my editor let me go to the Philippines and take photos for 3 months without filing a single thing. Right. Or, my editor let me, interview women who worked at nail salons for a year without submitting a single byline.
I just want 3 weeks.
So within journalism, it is well recognized that, or at least within the Times, it's well recognized that particularly for investigative, you do not want your news judgment clouded by metrics about output. So I would say part of the answer is to have management, particularly if you're in some place that's organized around a craft, to have management that doesn't use the numbers to make decisions that really should be made about the craft. That just requires patience, right? Because it's sort of it's slow thinking to look at some story and say, how important is that story? It's fast thinking to look at some story and say, how many clicks did it get, right? And that's easy to count, but it's not what counts, right? So part of it is not that part of the cultural struggle, I think, with any organization that's organized around a craft is not to be data phobic and not to say, get thee behind me data, but instead to say, I'm not going to go back to a world in which I can't count these things, but I'm going to have some sophistication about how I make particularly management decisions, particularly decisions around how I value people. And to remember that, we value people around their craft rather than around things that are easily counted.
Yeah, I would add too that we try to always ask the why around data and not just look at the data, which is I think what you're saying as well, right? Because just the data is only going to tell a part of the story, and it can also completely alter the course of what you're on. And so we like to kind of combine the raw data, the qualitative, to really tell a story and help, especially on the editorial side, really help them understand what is the purpose of X, and has that accomplished that? And that might be data, that might be qualitative, that might just be a gut feeling. But how do you use data to tell a part of that story instead of being, kind of the end all be all?
I think
you're saying that ultimately bean counters can be educated to do what you're trying to do.
Well, it's just that you don't necessarily want the bean counters to be making management decisions.
Yeah.
Like decisions about how you recruit, retrain, and promote people, right? Those should be made by people who possess and defend the craft rather than the bean counters. It's not that the bean counters shouldn't exist. It's just that you should remember that you're trying to create something of quality, and it's not necessarily clear that it should be led by numbers. For the particular case you're talking about, the New York Times though has the advantage of let's say last mover advantage. So the New York Times did not come as quickly to analytics and counting things as, say, Gawker. Right? So fortunately for us, Gawker already did the experiment of finding out what happens when you put a big board in front of people and you promote people or even compensate people based on clicks. Right? And so now we don't need to do that experiment. That experiment's been done.
Great. Thank you very much. That's very important.
Another question from the audience? Right here in the middle.
Hi, Tom Bittner, also user experience person. Great to see everybody up there on the panel. What's been your experience with, I call starting with the data and creating a product bottom up, and then starting with an idea, and then seeing how the data fits in top down? What has been your experience with creating products in both of those dimensions?
I don't know that I've ever really started with the data. I think in all of the projects, even from day one when I was at the Times, it was always thinking about a person and what problems they had and how I was going to integrate it into their process. A good Slack story is years ago we were working with an editor who wanted to get some advice on how to think rationally about promoting stories. Like if you think about journalism as ending with when it goes to the presses, right? Like stop to the presses, then you don't need to think about how you promote the story. So one of the things her group was created in the fall of 2014 was how do we make rational the way we promote stories on social? And so we started with her and her group and what are their problems and what is their process. One of the things we realized is that we can do a bunch of fancy MapReduce jobs and fancy machine learning stuff, but we can't make editors fire open Python. So, and they won't, if we build them a new web app, they won't open a web app. That was something I learned right away. But we realized that they love Slack. And there's a large section of the editors who spend all their day in Slack. which is wonderful because Slack can be programmed. Like you can make a Slack bot. So that was an example where we really led with the people's pain rather than with the data. And instead of saying to them, you need to open up Python or you need to go to this web app, we said, we're going to build you a friendly Slack bot.
Meet them where they are.
Sorry?
You're meeting them where they are.
And where they spend their time, which is in Slack. So by doing that, we could build them a conversational interface rather than asking them to come to our terms and use our tools. And in fact, I think it was useful for adoption because then it opens up all this sort of product thinking. Like we named it Blossom and represented it by some flowers rather than naming it GBX boosting for whatever or HAL 9000. So that was an example where we sort of tailored the product around the person who was the eventual set of users.
We have these conversations internally a lot at Slack. Slack was born out of this place of deep empathy because the founders were building the product literally for themselves while they were trying to start a game company, and so it was just a side product that they had going on. And so the company was founded around this deep user empathy and thinking very carefully about the product directions and not scared of technology by any sense, but not trying to optimize some KPI as like the number one thing. And then as the company has matured and data has sort of permeated everything that we do, you have that other contrasting balancing force. And I'm probably not qualified to sort of like opine on the software industry as a whole or anything like that, but I never let that stop me. If you've looked at companies that try to do the second thing that you described, which is sort of like take a gradient step in metrics and use that to point product direction, I think historically what you find is that it just doesn't work very well. And I think there's one company in particular that has a logo that looks like a little blue bird that I won't name, that has tried to do that a lot. And it's failed miserably. Whereas if they had this stronger product sense and used data to inform and kind of guide that product sense, they could have done a much better job.
I mean, I think these are right. It's like you want to start with a user need or something that your customers are going to want. A lot of times that starts from some sort of a hypothesis, which you then go into both quantitative and qualitative research phase. And the data that comes out of that may actually invalidate your hypothesis. That you thought that people wanted something, but it turns out they don't want that at all. There's a new opportunity that you discover through what their behavior is that they may not have even expressed before. And so I think there are opportunities where data can reveal new product opportunities, but it's just not being purely data-driven. And sort of making sure that you always are understanding why that is appropriate to the user or to your audience.
Yeah, we like to talk a lot about, kind of merging those things. And I think especially with the rise of, A/B testing becoming a lot more, common, I would say, it can be used often as a crutch where it just takes it just replaces decision making or having a real intuition about something or having something that you actually believe in. And so, same page, go into it with a hypothesis, use the data to inform that, to uncover insights that you wouldn't have found. When we were building our app that has the calendar product, it was a gut feeling. We were like, people use their calendars all the time. Let's try this. But then we used data to validate things like the price point, because there's one thing that, you can't have a gut feeling on. It's how much someone's going to pay for something. That is data driven. So it's definitely kind of constantly playing this balancing game. And I think you can't just do it one or the other.
Maybe a question on this side of the room oh, sorry. Right here up in the front. Oh, I thought.
It was a camera.
Oh.
Let me follow up on what you just said. I don't know if I can. Which is, is it preferable? Are there distinct categories where you decide it's appropriate to go with your gut, with intuition, versus those that really have to be justified with metrics?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't think there's like an exact science to it, but I do think there's probably two areas where we use data. So one is like the very clear, like A or B. I have a feeling on A, and I just need the data to just like validate this like very specific test, right? And you know, when I say people using A/B testing as a crutch, is that like oftentimes you might not even need that, but when you do, like you have a very clear if. You know, this is the answer. If this is the winner, then I will be doing this. And if this is the winner, then I will be doing this, right? That there's like this very clear sort of like boxed approach. And then the other category is really where you start to just like uncover things, you know, and that can be a little bit more like open-ended, right? So when we go into like any sort of like research or early product development phase, we do a lot of just like digging into the quantitative and the qualitative data to just sort of like uncover insights on our audience, right? So like we go into it with the gut feeling of like, you know, with this audience, we think that the majority of them are, you know, commuting like in this way. But like, how do we sort of validate that and uncover actually like a lot of them are communicating via car, you know, things like that. So I think I try to kind of separate the categories of like very specific tests, which is like letting the data tell you a story that lets you kind of be creative and really think differently about how you're approaching things.
I mean, I want to add to that because I think that's exactly right. It's, you know, you can use data in ways to optimize things that are sort of for the now.
Yeah.
But as you begin to think about more disruptive projects that you're doing, things that you don't know where they're going to lead, you don't really quite know even who your audience or your users are, it really does come down a little more to your gut because there is no data to even begin with. And then back to the challenge there is to make sure that you have more than one gut sort of doing this, because if it's just me, then you're going to get like a white guy's perspective on what this project should be. But if you have a more diverse group of people, then and a cross-disciplinary team that really trusts and works with each other, then you're going to have a better sort of intuition of what's possible.
I think one of the pitfalls that's easy to fall into is a lot of these things that we're trying to use data to answer are these very difficult to formalize questions like how important is the story, right? It's very hard to write down a metric for what that actually means, let alone measure the thing. And so what we sort of get taught to do in the world of data is to come up with proxies that are strong and probably directionally correct. And we've seen, you know, in media, so clicks must be a great proxy for how important something is. Then we lure ourselves into this false sense of security that as long as we're optimizing clicks, we're doing everything right. But you have to remember that you're measuring clicks when you go to do that. You're not measuring the original thing that you cared about. And so we try to keep ourselves in check, I think, an awful lot around what is it that we are actually trying to do and not to fall too far down the rabbit hole of just the best thing that we could do.
Good answer. Just to co-opt his answer. So part of it is not that there's different problems and some problems are data-driven and some are human-driven, but rather that at different stages in solving the problem, you might be using data more or less. So for example, you can go interview people. Then you can interview 100 people. And then you could use some data and say, what are the common themes that I find in those 100 customer interviewers? Then you have to use some gut to like hypothesize what are the possible things that I could do, new marketing campaigns or new products I could make that would address those people's problems. Then once you have a product that you're trying out, then you can use some A/B testing, which is a quantitative thing to do, to figure out like how can I slightly tweak this one solution and climb this one hill. Now that I've established a new hill, how do I use data to climb that hill better? But you have to keep talking to people who are using the product. Otherwise, you'll never realize things that even though you optimized it are just pathological things about product consequences. Mm-hmm. So coming back to bias, a good example of this is this 2013 paper by LaTanya Sweeney, who's now at Harvard, where she wrote about how entering, as she put it, black-sounding names into Google preferentially will give up things that say arrest records, right? So apparently there wasn't a sufficient number of Google search engineers who were typing those sounding names that nobody in Google ever noticed it, and it had to, take LaTanya to figure this out very much on the outside of Google to notice this effect. And, as she wrote at the time, this can have real consequences. If you're going up for a job and somebody else is going up for a job, and the employer Googles both your names, and the first result for LaTanya comes up arrest record, which she had never been arrested, by the way, she wrote. LaTanya Sweeney comes up with arrest record, and for the other candidates don't, that has an effect on people's careers. So I wouldn't say that you just say this problem is the data-driven problem and this ain't, but more likely at different steps as you develop out a solution and verify that that is a solution for everyone, there's opportunities to be qualitative and quantitative.
So everyone here has brought up essentially emerging media technologies and new interfaces. How do you consider these new experiences for your users, at the intersection of being, human-centered designed as well as being data-driven?
Yeah.
You brought up voice here.
Yeah, I think it's super exciting in that I think it's not only increasing potential touch points, but more importantly, a lot of these are sort of reducing friction for people. And so obviously voice interfaces are really exciting, that you can multitask, they fit right into what people are already doing. But, I would say, whether it's chat or just all of these things, it's just a very exciting time to be thinking about how you can just get a little bit closer to people and reduce friction for them. I think Slack has done a great job of that, obviously. What I do think is problematic is that these are not places to take what you're already doing and just shove them into new interfaces. And I think that's where we saw a lot of kind of the early adopters of some of these things, is that, it's obviously really exciting to innovate and try new things, but at the same time, there's the second you sort of like ruin the trust of a user with these new interfaces, you've kind of lost it. And it's like a really high mountain to climb to get back into getting them to trust you with one of these like new technologies, right? And so I think you kind of have to be careful in experimentation, but also really understanding that you're playing a dangerous game here. And so, when I think about whether it's voice, whether it's just conversational interfaces in general, it goes back to that human-centered design, right? It's really just thinking about what feels like native for this, right? What makes sense to have in terms of like a voice conversation or just a conversation in general. What should that really sound like, instead of just using it as like yet another content delivery mechanism?
I mean, I think voice is super interesting. There's a lot of challenges because with voice, you tend to get one answer back. So, that one answer better be pretty right. But I also feel like we're on the cusp of a pretty big change in how we interact with things with new technologies, whether it's AI or AR or VR. Mm-hmm. And we all should not be sort of passive recipients of this new technology. That I think all of us within our organizations should adopt some sort of a design hat and be involved in shaping what these things are, because I think we all bring really important perspectives to what we think the future of our organizations and our products and our education should be.
Mm-hmm. I think trust is a big one. Recently I was reading people saying journalism should optimize for trust rather than optimize for clicks. So it's nice to use a new piece of technology and have people be like, oh, gee whiz, this is cool. But it shouldn't be forced and it shouldn't be awkward. You want to think about how you optimize for the trust of the reader.
All right. I think that's all we have time for today for this panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you.